Sectarianism has spread its divisive influence across the Middle East, from the Persian Gulf to Lebanon and from Syria to Egypt. Already weakened nation-states struggling to grapple with the continued Sunni-Shia conflict and minority rights face new difficulties following the upheavals of the Arab Spring. What can the U.S. do to avoid adding fuel to the fire while securing its interests in the region? The Great Divide, Sunni versus Shia. Next on Great Decisions. In the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad, who founded Islam, died without leaving an heir. Two competing branches of Islam emerged, the Sunni and the Shia.
After the Prophet Muhammad died in the 7th century, the disagreement broke out almost immediately about who should succeed him. There was the camp who argued that his successor should be from among his closest companions, and the other camp argued for succession by bloodline.
And we have the period of fitna, or civil conflict, where the Prophet's companions were essentially fighting each other and going to war over these questions of who wields authority after the Prophet's death.
The roots of modern sectarianism, however, can be traced back to World War I. In 1916, the British and French started planning for the defeat of Germany and its ally, the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled much of the Middle East.
For 400 years, in most of this region, the source of political legitimacy was the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul.
After the end of World War I, the powers divided up the former Ottoman Empire to guarantee French and British influence.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement gave Syria and Lebanon to France, while Britain maintained control over what is now Israel, the Palestinian territories, Iraq, and Jordan.
It was a secret agreement during World War I, mainly between the French and the British, but also with the agreement of Russia, that if the three powers were able to defeat the Ottoman Empire in World War I, they would carve up the Arab provinces.
Many people in the Arab world have always been very resentful because they consider this the real symbol of colonialism. Many of these countries were not really countries. They were just artificially declared states by this agreement.
The British and French had divided some religious and ethnic communities, and had thrown other, formerly peaceful neighbors into competition with each other.
There isn't really any real sense of nationhood. The Kurds, for instance, have their own aspirations to statehood. They're a distinct cultural and ethnic group, and they were cutting up all these states in ways that led to a lot of grievance and to a lot of civil conflict and ultimately civil war.
A new era of sectarianism was born.
In most countries, the whole conflict became sectarian because religion became important as a form of identity.
There is a battle going on for the soul of Islam. What is the nature of an Islamic state in the 21st century? And we're seeing the ugliest manifestations of it. I don't know how it's going to finally sort itself out.
Perhaps no strain of violence in the Middle East has proven more virulent than the Sunni-Shia divide.
It colors almost everything that's happening in the region. It is the radio station that everybody's listening to. It is the song that you can play that people will respond to. Sectarianism is how people are identifying themselves at a time when state institutions are breaking down.
In many ways, Sunnis and Shias have managed to live together better than Protestants and Catholics did in Europe up until fairly recently. What has happened now is that you have resource competition, you have power competition.
With few communities putting a national identity over that of their tribe, religion, or community, central governments and the nations they served remained weak.
National identity has taken a back seat to sectarian and tribal affiliation, and part of that is because sectarianism, once it's unleashed, is very difficult to put back in.
In many countries, strongman dictators emerged.
Post-World War II, and in the beginning era of Arab independence, the strongmen took power. These were military men. They were men like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and later on Saddam Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad, and also Gaddafi, who were inspired by Nasser in Egypt, who had this sense of Arab nationalism.
Strongmen kept a lid on all those sectarian feelings, kept control of the country. It wasn't often very nice the way they did it, but it kept things quiet, and the US wasn't that unhappy about that quiet.
The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the occupation to follow exacerbated sectarian tensions.
The U.S. invasion of Iraq freed the majority of Iraqi Shia from a very violent repression by a minority Sunni government. It's possible to say that in that sense it, exacerbated the tensions, but the tensions were there. I mean, Saddam Hussein had gassed Kurds and repressed the majority rather brutally. So we didn't create those tensions. We lifted the lid, I guess you'd have to say.
A few years ago, Americans probably didn't know the difference between a Sunni or a Shia. And Iraq and the civil war in Iraq itself began to introduce us to it.
When we got to Iraq, I think many of us, myself included, were initially not fully aware of how deep and important the divide is.
Saddam Hussein, from Iraq's Sunni minority, ruled with a proverbial iron fist. He was a proponent of Baathism.
Baathism literally in Arabic means renewal. It promoted the sense of a kind of a pan-Arab renewal, and it dreamed of unifying the Arabs, certainly beginning in the Levant, but also moving on to other Arab countries. And Baathism was strongly secular and rejected the influence or involvement of Islam in state power.
One of the original sins was the de-Baathification process. And most of the Ba'ath Party leaders under Saddam Hussein were Sunni. When you disband the army and you're essentially pushing a lot of Sunnis outside the political process, and when they don't have a stake in the new political system, they're more likely to resort to violence. And that's where we see Sunni militants targeting Shias more and more in the mid-2000s as Iraq descends into terrible civil conflict.
After the Saddam Hussein regime was toppled, a Shia government took shape in Iraq.
When the Americans came, it was very clear that they were backing the Shia majority in Iraq. And the Sunnis saw that as disenfranchisement, that they had privileges under Saddam Hussein, and now not only had they lost them, but they saw no way to have a voice in the government that was forming in Baghdad.
Constitutional foundations of the new Iraqi state were structured. You have a president who's supposed to be Kurdish. You have a prime minister who's supposed to be Shia. The Speaker of Parliament is supposed to be Sunni. So in a way, you're entrenching those divides, and politics becomes a competition over power and resources and spoils and patronage.
In 2011, the Arab Spring saw protesters in several nations hoping to overthrow the oppressive rule that many had known for decades. Only a few succeeded.
The Arab Spring is in large part a response to the behavior of dictators and strongmen in the Arab world, and to the dominance of these dictators really since the 1960s, even the 1950s.
Since the end of the Iranian Revolution, 1979, when a new dynamic revolutionary force came to power in Tehran, Shia communities, who are a minority in most countries they live in, but not in some, Iraq being notable, woke up and said, what about us?
The cap is blown off. The kings and dictators and generals, at least for a moment, were no longer in control, and it looked like many of them were going to be swept aside.
These conflicts were always bubbling below the surface, but as long as you had authoritarian leaders who could manage and suppress those conflicts, there was the appearance of stability.
Ultimately, the Arab Spring is about not just young people, but people in general in that part of the world wanting to live in dignity. He didn't say democracy, I said dignity, and that means not having to pay corrupt officials for even simple things like driver's licenses or business licenses. It means not being abused if you're arrested by the police.
Many of the elites in those countries were enriching themselves in a way that was not sitting very well with much of the traditional populace. And with the revolution in modern communications technology, it became much easier to rally in the streets to overthrow elected leaders. Even in nations that successfully ousted their dictators, the future is uncertain. I think weakness of the Arab Spring is that one saw the power of revolution, but at the same time there wasn't sufficient social cohesion to put in place a new political order.
Much of this has come to very bad ends. So Libya is virtually without a state. Egypt is back to a semi-authoritarian state system where El-Sisi is not very different from President Mubarak, so whatever all these students had in mind has not come to pass. Tunisia has some possibilities, but it's a very small country. So I think there's been much less change than had been anticipated.
There is not a free press in Egypt. The women's movement has suffered. Every form of civil society has suffered now that the military-led government is in power. So this government is even more oppressive than Mubarak.
Why, in fact, did those who were interested in democracy fail to come forward and lead? And why were they, in effect, shut out by either, on the one hand, military government, or on the other hand, by religiously based parties and ideas? In part because in the evolution of Arab thought and in the unrolling of these ideas, these latter particular influences were stronger.
In Syria, where its Arab Spring failed to quickly topple the government of President Bashar al-Assad, centuries of sectarian tensions engulfed the region and showed a dark reality to the sectarian divide.
The early protests in Syria in March of 2011, those were largely nonviolent, they were peaceful, and they expressed a sense of disenchantment that had been building up for 4 decades against the Assad regime.
It broke into a sectarian fight rather quickly. You have a minority regime, which is Alawite, supported by Christians, Druze, and in some ways Kurds, against a Sunni majority in the country. And so once you had the Syrian uprising, then sectarianism took off across the region in ways that we haven't seen in a long time.
The regime in general has tried to use the sectarian card as a means of consolidating its support among that minority Alawi community, and in so doing has terribly aggravated fault lines within Syrian society that date back centuries.
a great percentage of the population was secular. Then it had, of course, a secular government. But once these uprisings became sort of transnational, so they began bleeding across borders, then what happens in Iraq affects Syria, what happens in Lebanon affects Syria. And that's how religion, as it had been in Iraq, became a driving force of the conflict in Syria, and it became sectarian.
The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria has claimed territory in Syria and Iraq, where it says it has founded an Islamic caliphate.
What we're seeing in the ISIS phenomenon is something that is rooted in what happened in Iraq starting in 2003. ISIS has its origins in Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was a reaction to the American invasion and occupation, a reaction that was exacerbated frankly, by the joining to Al-Qaeda in Iraq of some of the former elements of the Saddam Hussein regime.
If you look at some of the literature that the Islamic State, ISIS, has put out in the last year or so, they have declared that they are going to redraw the borders in revenge for Sykes-Picot, in revenge for colonial powers mapping out the Middle East.
They're not just terrorists. They have a serious vision, a scary one, of course, but a serious vision for governance. And what they're doing in the territories they hold is running local administrations, dispensing justice through Sharia courts, providing for some modicum of law and order. They're running the electricity and the water.
Sunni groups in Iraq have allied themselves with ISIS, and at least one major Ba'athist militant group has taken shape in Iraq's provinces.
There was a moment that the Sunnis of Iraq did turn against al-Qaeda in cooperation with the US military and backed at that time by the Iraqi government. But when the Americans pulled out, that Iraqi government went back on a lot of those promises to the Sunni community. Iraq had a comeback with al-Qaeda. And that's where ISIS comes from.
What really contributed to the spread of ISIS in Iraq is the failure of the Iraqi government to treat its Sunni citizens decently. So their loyalty to their own government was diminished by the fact that it didn't really treat them as citizens.
Lebanon is also feeling sectarian pressures. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees who have fled across the border are putting an increasing strain on Lebanon's resources.
جينا لنتقوى هون بيوتنا انهدت شرد اولادنا شرد النساء الشيوخ كلها ما خلى حدا طفشنا.
Because the vast majority of the Syrian refugees coming into Lebanon are Sunni, there is a fear such a large number of Sunnis coming into Lebanon would tip the balance toward the Sunnis of Lebanon.
We used to have 60% Christians in Lebanon and 40% Muslims. Now it's the opposite. Now, after the Syrian refugees, I think it's going to be down to 25% Christians and 75% Muslims. This is creating a big issue.
You have three communities that are constantly competing for dominance and competing for their position in Lebanon, and those are the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Maronites. And everything in the construction of the Lebanese government is based around these three communities.
Lebanon was, an artificial construct, but it was also sort of emblematic of what the Middle East is and ought to be. It's a mosaic of all these religions and ethnicities.
In some ways, the Syrian conflict can be seen as a proxy war between nations with interests in the region.
Iran supports the Assad regime. It's had an alliance with the Assad regime since the early 1980s, since the Iran-Iraq war, and that alliance has endured through all that time. Saudi Arabia supports the rebels, and other Gulf countries also support the rebels. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, some of them support different factions. But the largest proxy war is really between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
The Gulf Arabs have sought to overthrow the Assad regime and have fed the fighting. And in a sense, it's also become a struggle between the United States and Russia.
Iran's goal, in my view, is to increase its influence in the region. You know, it's a Persian Shia country, and the Shia have, in the Muslim world, including in the Middle East, been downtrodden for centuries.
Iran needs the Assad regime in Syria, and it needs it for one thing in particular. The Assad regime has demonstrated very clearly over the last decade that it's willing to do anything Iran wants in terms of supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Iran considers Hezbollah to be its main pressure point on Israel, and frankly, its first line of defense if Israel decides to attack Iranian nuclear facilities.
Both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have sought to contain Iranian influence in the region.
Iran wants ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, dead in Iraq, where it poses a direct security threat to Iran and to Iran's Iraqi allies. It wants it alive in Syria, at least long enough to be able to wipe out the nationalist opposition to the Assad regime inside Syria.
Now, national boundaries in the Middle East are at risk of shifting.
The borders in the region are being redrawn. Countries are being partitioned. Statelets are replacing states.
Borders no longer have the same significance. So whether it's Syria or Iraq, the conflicts within those countries transcend the borders of those countries. And the governments in each case, in Damascus and Baghdad, have demonstrated that they are unable to stop the violence.
If Iraq does divide, it's not going to be this sectarianism, it's going to be a failure of political governance. Now, it could end up being divided that way, but it's going to be ugly because not all Sunnis live in the middle, not all Shias live in the south, not all Kurds live in the north. And even within those three great groups, some people are educated urbanites, some are uneducated farmers. It doesn't divide that simply.
As Iraq has proven, forming a viable democracy is a messy process at best. At worst, a fragile state can be an incubator for extremist groups seeking to export terror.
We went abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We found some. We bred some more. Some of them are following us home. That wasn't smart.
If any one particular ethnic or religious group doesn't feel that they have a stake in the system or they don't have the requisite share of power, they're going to say, well, we don't want to be a part of this state, we don't want to be a part of the government, and then they have an incentive to play spoiler.
Democracy should be promoted and supported in whatever way that we can do so, but we should know and understand that those who will bring democracy, and I believe there are some who can, to an evolving Middle East, will do so over a long period of time.
And it's not just sectarianism driving the divide. Economics and demographics play a central role as well.
Throughout this region, you have this tremendous youth bulge. You have very, very high percentage of young people who have very, very limited economic opportunities. With that kind of a situation, it's very, very difficult to think of the kind of rule of law that brings about consent of the governed, that ultimately brings about what we would call democratic processes.
It's being driven by economics, governance, and if you want, man-made problems that therefore are open to man-made solutions, not God-based debates that can only be decided by clerics.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP.